Here are the optimized settings for Stalker 2 Heart of Chernobyl. So what I want you to do is to copy these settings into your game. Okay, just copy these, as you can see here. And then just follow me here and we'll optimize your game. Keep in mind that this is DLSS native. This is not like downscaled. Also, what you want to do is, if you have NVIDIA Reflex low latency, please enable this. This is really good. All right. And the second thing, on this option, make sure that your GPU is selected, okay, not your CPU. And thirdly, make sure to update your NVIDIA drivers. It's very important, okay, especially for this game. Now, what we want to do is to go into game, go outside of town, okay, don't look into town, look into the wilderness where there's no like NPCs and all that. And don't stand stationary, because as you can see, our FPS is like 62, 63. This is pretty good. You're like, oh, I already have 60 FPS. No, you do not have 60 FPS, because when you start moving, it will start dipping, as you can see. 53, 54, 55, 58, right? So make sure that when you're testing, make sure that you are moving, okay? Now, if you already have 60 FPS with those settings, okay, then you're good to go. Just go to the next chapter and we'll talk about other things, okay? If you don't have 60 FPS like me, I'm still dipping below like 60. As you can see here, it's 55, 56, right? Here's what you want to do. You go to the settings, graphics, go to the DLSS and put it on quality, okay? Save the settings and test again. Make sure you're moving and look at your FPS. As you can see from me here, we already have above 60 FPS constantly, okay? Make sure it's constant, all right? Make sure it doesn't dip below 60 FPS. And it appears that we're good, okay? So for my system, we are good to go. So if you're like me, you have already 60 FPS with these changes, then just go to the next chapter. Now, if you don't have 60 FPS with DLSS quality, then what you want to do is to go back to the graphics. If you are like maybe 58, 57, like not too far from 60 FPS, then just put it on balanced, right? Put it on balanced and you should be you should be good to go. If you are way below that, like maybe 54, 50, 53, 50 something, right? Then put it on performance instead and test it out again, okay? Test the game, make sure that you're moving and make sure that you have 60 FPS, okay? If you have 60 FPS with these changes, then you're good to go. Just go to the next chapter, all right? Now, if you still don't have 60 FPS with performance DLSS, okay? So we need to optimize your game even more, okay? So here's what you're gonna do. If you have a graphics card with VRAM, maybe like 6 gigabytes of VRAM, you should probably lower this to like high or even medium, okay? It doesn't affect FPS, but it will consume more VRAM if you have it on Epic, especially in crowded areas. So it won't affect your FPS, but it will stutter your game, okay? So keep that in mind. The second thing, we want hair to go on low, because this is very extensive, okay? Keep this on Epic, keep this on Epic. Materials, put this on high, okay? Go back down. The shadows quality, put it on medium, okay? The fog, put it on low. And the foliage, well, you don't want to change the foliage now, but just keep it on medium for now, okay? And save your settings, okay? Save your settings, go back into the game and test out the FPS again. Make sure that you're moving. If you still do not have 60 FPS when doing this, then you can start degrading the quality of the game a little bit by disabling, by putting shadows on low and on foliage on low as well, okay? This will make the foliage look bad and the shadows look bad as well. But I mean, you need FPS, then you should probably do this, and maybe even shading quality, okay? I don't recommend this, but you can do this if you want, all right? And the last resort, you can also go even further and put it on ultra performance. Okay, this will make the game look a little bit blurry and jagged, but if you have a small screen, then you should probably be good to go, and you should probably have 60 FPS at this point. All right, if you still don't have 60 FPS at this point, then there's two options. Either you just deal with it and you accept that you have like a bit of a low FPS. I mean, it's a single player game. If you play it with like 45 FPS or 40 FPS, like it's not that bad, right? It's really not that bad. So either you settle for a bit low FPS or you go and enable frame generation, okay? But keep in mind that because you are below 60 FPS, when you enable frame generation, you will have a lot of latency, okay? This is why I make this important, that getting 60 FPS constantly outside of town is very important for this, right? Because if you enable frame generation when you are below 60 FPS, then you will get kind of a lot of latency when playing the game, all right? So now that we are all on the same page, we all probably have 60 FPS constantly at this point while moving. Okay, keep in mind that this is while moving. This is where it's important that we have 60 FPS constant, because when we look into town, as you can see here, the FPS started dropping a lot. As you can see, 38, 37, 40, right? This is quite insane. As you can see, it dips a lot. Okay. Now, is this your system's fault? No, this is not your system's fault. This is the game's fault. Because the game, especially in these crowded areas where there's a lot of NPCs, there's a lot of AI stuff. There's AI pathing, A-Life, the scheduling of AI, like scripts and all that, and there's a lot of NPCs as well. So the game is just not optimized yet, okay? So you will have bad FPS in town areas. I mean, no matter what CPU you have, even like high-end CPUs, to a certain extent, of course, if you have a really high-end CPU, you will have better FPS, but the area, if you have a high-end GPU, it will bottleneck your system, right? It will still bottleneck your system. So this is not your fault, okay? If you have this is normal. Everybody has a bottleneck in NPC areas. It's, I mean, it is what it is, right? Now, what we can do about it, okay? There's three options. The first option, if you're like me, right? If you're like me, if I was just gaming for myself, right? If I was just gaming for myself, I probably have DLSS quality. Outside of town, I have like maybe 60 FPS, as we said earlier. For me, quality, it gives me like constant 60 FPS when moving, etc., right? So this is good for me. And when I go into town, yeah, I get a little bit of like, you know, like 40 FPS or 30 FPS or whatever, right? So for me, it doesn't really matter because this is a hub area anyway. You're not gonna fight here. You're just probably gonna go to your stash, to the vendor, to the mechanic, do some NPC quests, talk to NPCs, etc., right? So it really doesn't matter. It's not important to have like high FPS in crowded areas anyways. So for me personally, this doesn't bother me. So I will just keep playing like this and I'm gonna be fine, all right? So this is the first option. The second option is where the 60 FPS comes in hand, right? This is why I'm constantly talking about having constantly 60 FPS outside of town, because what we can do is enable frame generation, okay? If you have a 40 series card, you can enable DLSS frame generation. If you don't have a 40 series card, you should probably enable FSR3 frame generation, okay? So if we enable this, as you can see, outside of town, we are at around like 100 FPS, 120, yeah. If we go inside of town, instead of having 30 FPS or 40 FPS, as you can see here, we are at 80 FPS, right? Because the DLSS frame generation is basically virtual frames or something. I'm not really sure about it, but basically it doesn't get affected by the CPU bottleneck, right? It pushes through that, okay? And this is why you get a very smooth experience even in crowded areas where it's not optimized. As you can see, it's very smooth, right? Now, with the latency, does it have latency? Because hub areas reduce your original FPS from 60. We had constant 60 FPS outside of town. Inside of town, we had around like 40 FPS when moving, right? So it reduces the FPS below that 60%, that 60 FPS. Then frame generation will cause you a little bit of latency, right? Because you don't have a constant 60 FPS when moving here. So you do feel a little bit of latency, especially if you don't have an NVIDIA card. Because for the NVIDIA, as we said earlier, we have the NVIDIA Reflex low latency. So that helps a lot with the latency. As you can see here, even that my FPS is below 60 here, and I'm with frame generation, the latency is pretty much not here. Like, I cannot really feel it too much. It's still there, like you can feel it a little bit, but it's very, very subtle, right? As you can see, when we move, like, I barely feel the latency, okay? And why 60 FPS outside of town is important? Because when we go outside of town, we have originally a constant 60 FPS, right? And because we have frame generation, now there's basically no latency because we already have 60 FPS originally, right? So frame generation does not cause any latency. Like you don't feel it at all. Like I cannot feel any latency, right? And this is why it's important to at least get a base of 60 FPS, all right? So this is basically option number 2. Now, option number 3, it's a little bit annoying, okay? It's a little bit annoying, and this is only if you really want to like optimize your experience, right? What you want to do, let's say you are outside of town without frame generation, right? There we go. You're outside of town without frame generation, right? You're playing the game, you have constant 60 FPS, even when moving, you're good to go, right? And let's say you've done like your quests and all that, you're about to enter town. Now, oh, I'm about to enter town. Okay, let's just go to options and enable frame generation, right? There we go. We have frame generation on and we go into town. We have a smooth experience here, right? I do my quests, I go to my stash, do some vendors, sell some stuff, etc. When I'm done here and I'm about to go out again to do some other quests and basically go explore, I just go outside of town. Alright, I'm done with the town. Now let's just go back to my options, go to graphics and disable the frame generation. Alright, so this is what you can basically do, right? It's a little bit annoying as I said, but this is only if you really want to optimize like your experience, okay? Alright, a quick thing about frame generation that I didn't mention is that frame generation does not affect the cutscenes, okay? So just keep that in mind. For example, when you come here in Zalicia for the first time and you have the cutscene in this bar, as you can see we have 90 FPS or 100 FPS or something like that. When you start the cutscene here, basically the cutscene plays at your original FPS, right? And the original, in this case, the original FPS is about like 50 FPS or 45 for me. So when you enter this area, just keep in mind that cutscenes will play at your original FPS. Okay, so don't be like, don't get surprised when the cutscenes are like playing really laggy or whatever in like, especially in hub areas. Maybe the cutscenes outside of hub areas are fine, but inside hub areas they will play at your original FPS, and in this case it will play at around like 45 or something, so it will look very laggy. Now personally, does this bother me? Well, I mean, for me, it doesn't really bother me, because again, my point stands that 90% of the game you will be outside of town, right? You'll be outside of town areas and you'll be playing the game outside of the hub areas, right? The hub areas are only 10% of the game or something, right? And especially the cutscenes as well, they're not the whole game, okay? So I'd rather sacrifice like that 10% and get like the original FPS in that 10%, maybe like 40 FPS or 50 FPS, right? When looking at cutscenes, and get 90% of the game a really high FPS, smooth, very good, right? Rather than just sacrifice the whole game and make it look blurry and just for like that little 10%, okay? So for me personally, I rather just use frame generation and have a good experience in 90% of the game than not use it and have a decent experience in the whole game, if that makes sense. All right, now let's just go, if you're wondering like what each option does. Again, the texture quality, this only affects the VRAM, okay? Like it doesn't affect FPS at all. If you have a low VRAM, like for example, I have a 4060 Ti with 16 gigabyte model, right? So I'm pretty much good to go, right? But if you have like let's say a 8 gigabyte VRAM card, right? If you have an 8 gigabyte VRAM card, especially if you are using frame generation as well, and let's just say you are gaming not on 1080p, but you are gaming on 4040p, right? Then that will consume a lot of VRAM, especially in town areas and in hub areas, right? So I probably would recommend putting this on high and see how it works. And maybe even going to medium if you're encountering a lot of stutters in hub areas, okay? Now, the hair is very extensive, all right? I found out from testing medium is probably the best. Like it does like remove a little bit of the reflections on their hair, but it's not really a big deal, and it gives you like 7 FPS or 6 FPS or something, so it's really worth it. Going too low also gives you like maybe like 1 extra FPS or 2 extra FPS, but it's not that important, so I probably just keep it on medium. Object details and effect quality, just keep these on epic. These don't matter, they don't affect FPS at all. Materials, epic and high, there's barely any difference, and it does give you like maybe 1 FPS or 2 FPS. But going from high to medium or low, the terrain will start looking really bad, so just don't do that. Keep it on high or on epic, okay? Post-processing, this basically just makes the ambient occlusion more rich around like objects and all that. So, and it doesn't affect FPS at all, either epic or low, so just keep it on epic. Anti-aliasing, this only works if you use TAA, okay? And we're not using TAA because we have DLSS, so why would you use TAA? But yeah, so just keep this on low on epic. It doesn't work anyway with DLSS, so whatever. Motion blur, depth of field, these are basically just your preference. Me, I just don't like it. I just put it on low, no motion blur. Light shafts, either enabled or disabled, this doesn't really matter, neither FPS nor the graphics wise, so just keep this on enabled. Sharpness, you should probably have this on 10 if you are using DLSS native. If you are on quality, probably go to 20%. DLSS quality or FSR, well, basically if you have NVIDIA, you should probably use DLSS. Generally, if you have AMD, probably go for FSR. But for me personally, especially when I'm recording, I should probably use DLSS native, right, for the best image quality with frame generation. Now, here's the trick. If you are recording, it's better to use FSR native, because FSR native is way better than DLSS native, okay? Why? Because DLSS native makes the image blurry when you move, right? Meanwhile, FSR native does not make the image blurry when you move. It just adds a little bit of noise in the textures, right? And that noise basically keeps the image sharp, right? So when you are recording and then you render your video and YouTube compresses it, it doesn't blur the image too hard, right? So it keeps the image quality a little bit sharp, right? So this is probably better for YouTube. I mean, from what I tested personally, this gave me the best results, okay? Now, frame generation, we already talked about this. Shading quality, this is basically the quality of the shadows around objects. This is like basically the ambient occlusion. And going from medium to epic, there's barely any difference, and it gives you like a little bit of FPS, maybe like 4 or 5 FPS. Going too low though, do not go there, okay, because it will start making the shadows look a little bit like jagged and all that. So it's better to just keep it on medium. Global illumination from high to epic, there's barely any difference, and it gives you like maybe like 2 FPS or 3 FPS. So just keep this on high. Going to medium or low, the rooms start looking way darker or way brighter. Okay, so just keep it on high. This is probably the best setting here. Reflections, keep it on epic, it doesn't matter. It makes the reflections look a little bit better on the water and all that, and it doesn't affect FPS at all, so just keep this on epic. The shadow quality, again, this is basically the shadows. From high to epic, you do get a little bit of a drop in FPS, but the shadows are more expansive. Basically, it's like the leaves on the ground will start having a bit like more depth in the shadows and all that, but it's not really that big of a difference in terms of visuals, so I recommend keeping this on high. When you go to medium and low, the shadows will start looking a little bit weird and flickery, and shadows in the distance as well will start disappearing, right? So probably keep this on high. If you really need FPS, go to medium, but just don't go to low because it will look really bad. Okay, now the clouds and the sky, these two settings don't really matter. They do make like the sky and the clouds, especially when in like emissions or in like big storms, right? It does make the quality look better, but it doesn't affect FPS at all in those two situations, so just keep this on epic, they don't really matter. The fog is very expensive in terms of FPS. If you go to epic, there's like from epic to medium, you gain like maybe 6 FPS or something, or 5 FPS, which is pretty weird, even when there's no fog, right? It's like, it's everywhere, I think. But this is mostly noticeable when there's like sunrise or sunset, or you're like in a building and there's like light shafts coming in, right? You start noticing from epic, it gives you the best quality. To medium, you start looking, they start to look a little bit pixelated. The fog coming in, it will start looking like a little bit pixelated, which is weird. But medium is basically the best option here. Like, it doesn't degrade the visuals too much, and it still gives you a nice FPS boost. Going too low though, it will start looking really bad, especially when you move. You will start looking like seeing noise in the fog and like pixelated everything, especially in storms, right? So just keep this on medium. It's probably the best idea here. Now, foliage quality, this is very expensive, okay? Now, going to epic to medium, basically what the game does, this is for the distance of the foliage, right? So, from epic to medium, it does not remove or edit any foliage. It just edits the density of the foliage in the distance, right? So the foliage is still the same, just the density of it in the distance gets changed, okay? So medium will give you the best performance while keeping the best visual. If you go to low, then the game will start removing some assets from the foliage in the distance. So for example, if you look at the poppy field in the distance, with low, the pop field is not visible, right? But with medium, it is there. You see the red things, but they're just a little bit less dense, okay? I hope that makes sense. Environment draw distance, basically almost no difference, neither in visual or in FPS from what I tested. So just keep this on epic, all right? So yeah, these are, I hope this was helpful. I mean, these are the optimized settings from what I tested so far. Again, not this, probably DLSS quality or whatever upscaling you had to use when we were testing earlier, and just use this. Make sure that if you change these 5 settings here to restart your game, because it requires you to restart the game. I don't know if it actually makes a difference or not, but just do it. I mean, if the game tells you, I mean, just do it, I guess, right? So yeah, this is basically it. Again, we are on Discord changes. Yes, okay. We are on 4060 Ti 16GB model with a Ryzen 5 7600, the normal version, not the X version, and we are on full screen borderless. I mean, borderless or exclusive, it doesn't really matter. I tested it on both choices, and the FPS doesn't change, so just keep it on borderless, it's way better. And that's about it. Alright, this is about it for the optimized settings for Stalker 2 Hard Chernobyl. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe and give it a like. If you want to see me venture into the zone in Stalker 2 for the first time, then click on this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and of course, good hunting, Stalkers.